very often we get the impression that one in a way excludes the other, in a way that there's a contradiction between that, and this may not be a conclusion that is coming from Islam, maybe from other religions and whatnot. So what we're talking about today is something that applies, of course, mostly to Islam, even though there will be some generalities. So there will be some generalities that apply to other religions, but I'll be, of course, talking from the Islamic perspective more than anything else. You know, when you're talking about Islam and science, of course, I think it's really important to define what we're talking about. And just came up with a few definitions of what science means and what religion means. You know, the Webster says that science is knowledge attained through study or practice. That's one definition. Another one, it's knowledge covering general truths of the operation of general laws, worldly laws, especially obtained and tested through scientific method concerned with the physical world, underlying physical. So in other words, it does not deal with all kinds of knowledge, but there is a limited scope. And sometimes we forget that, and we try to think, or we tend to think that basically science can answer all the questions. So its scope actually is limited. So what that means is that science refers to a system of acquiring knowledge. The system uses observation and experimentation to describe and explains natural phenomena. This is science. Now when it comes to the definition of religion, of course it gets messier because there are so many definitions of religion, because there are many religions actually. One of the definitions of religion is it's the belief in and the worship of a god or gods, or any such system of belief and worship, usually involving devotional and ritual observances, and often containing a moral code governing the conduct of human being. But this is not universally accepted by everybody. Some actually define it as a spirituality. And there's not always actually a deity in there that's involved. Another definition says that it is something that involves the relationship that we have with the universe. In other words, a deity is not in there, but in a certain way. So some of the other definition, a strong belief in a supernatural power or powers that control human destiny. Another one, an institution to express belief in a divine power. Yet another one, the sum of total of answers given to explain humankind's relationship to the universe. So these are some of the definition of religion. And obviously, you know, it depends on how you define religion to talk about the relationship between science and religion. As I said, that I'll be talking about the relationship of Islam specifically, even though there will be some generalities regarding Islam and science. So Islam that we'll be talking about, of course, as derived from the Quran and the authentic, underlying authentic sayings and actions of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is really what Islam, what I'll be referring to as Islam as defined by these two sources. Now, if you're talking about any efficient or any accurate source of information, then that accurate source of information, if it's dealing with a reality that we're living in, it should lead to that. In other words, it should describe something that we're observing, if it is something relevant to that which we are observing. That's why the reality becomes a tool of assessing the accuracy of that information. And if you have two tools that are independently accurate, they should lead to the same conclusion, unless one of them is flawed in a certain way. Now, with that being said, when you're talking about Islam, the source of information in Islam actually comes from, let me put this one first. So this will be religion. This will be science. Sorry for the bad handwriting. When you're talking about source of information in Islam, you're talking about three sources. So in Islam, any source of or any information is obtained through one of three sources. One is by direct observation or direct feeling. In other words, there's a direct connection. It's a direct way of acquiring information through seeing, microscopes, telescopes, all of that go under that category. So the first way of acquiring any information is direct by observation. The second way is indirect through analysis, deduction, experimentation, and it's also accurate, of course, if it's done correctly. Indirect, you know, deduction, analysis, science is in there, of course. And the third one is relayed information. What do I mean by relayed information? Any idea? By the way, are these two clear? The first two, are they clear? Yes, no? Yes, no?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, maybe? Okay. So direct, that's one way of knowing, anything is by directly observing it. Second way is by analysis. In other words, you don't have to perceive it directly, but you can know through analysis that something exists. So for example, if I'm sitting here and I see a stone being thrown out of that door, then I can tell that there's a human being in there, even though I can't see him, I can't hear him, I can't feel anything, but I know that there's a human being. So it's an indirect. And experimentation is an example of that. When you try to analyze certain given information and come up with a conclusion together. The relayed information refers to information that was conveyed to you through a trustworthy source. So if you can establish the trustworthiness of the source, then you can establish the credibility and the trustworthiness of the information. An example of here, of course, is revelation. That's an example of that. An example of that is, let's say, take an example. Sometimes I mentioned Siberia. Has anyone been to Siberia? Okay, that's a good example. None of us has ever been to Siberia, but yet we know that Siberia exists, right? I mean, we don't doubt that. We know that it exists. How do we know that? It came to us through so many sources, right? It's there in the books, and so many independent sources that we can establish with certainty that Siberia exists, right? Another example would be the World War I, World War II. None of us has lived through these two major events, but yet we know for certain that these two actually exist. How do we know that? It came to us through a trustworthy source of information. They are so independent that it's impossible for them to agree to make a big lie, right? So in other words, if you can establish the credibility of the source, you can establish the accuracy of the information. So this is another way of acquiring information. And an example of that, of course, is revelation. This is another way. Now, when it comes to, keep that in mind, when it comes to science and religion, of course, these are two spheres that they overlap in a certain area. In other words, they're not exactly one over the other, but they're not completely actually distinct from one another. So there is an area of overlap. Religion sometimes may address certain scientific issues for a reason. One of them to indicate, one of them is just, it could be a source of guidance. For example, when the Prophet ﷺ, when the Quran says, eat and drink and do not squander. This is something that can be considered basically worldly, but it is something that is mentioned in the Quran. When the Prophet ﷺ tells us to take care of the environment, of the trees, not to cut trees like that without, this is part of also the physical world, but it's in the religion as well. Or for example, the prophetic medicine. There are certain ahadith that give some advice, that as to what could be of benefit and of use and whatnot. So that's one of the reasons why we have the overlap, is that it could be a piece of information that is beneficial to us. The second reason why we have the overlap is to indicate the divine nature of the Quran, of the book. That's why the Quran may mention certain verses or certain verses, certain things that were, let's say, impossible to know at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, certain scientific things. And the purpose of this is again to prove the divinity of that text. One talks, for example, about the stages of the embryo formation in the womb of the mother. When it talks about the fact that the gender of the fetus is determined by the father and not by the mother. That is mentioned in the Quran as well. So the value of these verses, and there are some of these verses, there are maybe not too many, but the value of these verses is, again, to prove something. So the Quran is not a book of science. The Quran has some scientific aspects that prove a certain point. And here, if you want more information, I would refer you to the writings. There's a book, of course, the classic by Maurice Bucaille, The Quran, the Bible, and Science. He talks and describes actually some of these things. The third reason why we have this overlap region, it's because life is a continuum. In other words, when you're living through your life, you don't divide your life, now I'm going to act in a scientific way, now I'm going to act in a religious way, you should shift gear. It's the same person. There's a continuum in there. There's no separation. That's why you may have a book of religion talking about some scientific matters. For that reason, there is actually an overlap. Now, but however, at the same time, as I said, the Quran is not meant to be a book of science. Because sometimes, you know, there's a common saying among us that we say, well, the Quran is a complete book that has everything. Well, the Quran has everything as far as guidance is concerned. But it's not a complete book in the absolute. So the Quran does not mention, for example, every historical event. Actually, the Quran itself tells us that there are certain stories that were not told to Prophet Muhammad. Allah says that there are certain prophets that we told you about, certain prophets we did not tell you about. So there are certain things that the Quran doesn't mention. And again, because it is not meant to be a book of history, a book of engineering, a book of natural history. You know, very often the brothers will ask, what does Islam say about dinosaurs? What does Islam say about dinosaurs? What?
Nothing.
Nothing. Why does Islam have to say anything about dinosaurs? I'm sorry, you know, Quran does not say anything about dinosaurs because the Quran is not meant to be a book of natural history. But again, it mentions some scientific things for a purpose. But there are certain things that were left out because they may not be relevant. So again, there are certain things that are not mentioned in there. So the religion basically recognizes that there are certain aspects of life that are covered by science that Islam does not say anything about. That's why there's a big sphere in the Sharia actually that is called the Masalih al-Mursala, matters of proven benefit that are left open. So for example, Islam does not say how to pave streets, how to build a building. It does not say anything of that because this is not what the Quran actually is meant to be. Now from the side of the science, sometimes, and this is not good science, I think good science knows its limitation, but sometimes bad and sometimes even common science does not recognize the fact that there are certain matters in here that are not related to this. So what could be, for example, some of the matters in the religion that are not actually covered by science?
Could be the afterlife?
The who?
The afterlife?
What, is there a name for that?
Jannah or Jannah?
Jannah or Jahannam. You know, when you're talking about religion, you're talking about two main parts. There are the commands, and that includes the prohibitions. And then here you have, let's say, for example, the rituals. You have the legislations. And you have the morals. There are also narrations. So the Quran is divided into these two main by theme. And this includes stories, as well as, let me call it, I'm going to call it unseen's. I'll explain that. So when you're talking about commands and prohibitions, rituals like what?
How to pray.
How to pray, how to fast, you know. So in other words, there are certain things in the commands of the Quran that tells us how to worship. This is in the Quran. Ritual legislations like what? Certain halal, haram, you know, this is do this, don't do that, certain prohibitions, it's in there. Morals, of course, you know, the commands of praising certain values that every Muslim should have. Narrations, of course, in the Quran include stories, like stories of the earlier prophets, for example. You know, you'll find that in there. And also, maybe, certain prophetic narrations of things that did not happen at the time, like when Allah mentioned in the beginning of Surah An-Nur, that the Romans were defeated, and after the defeat they would be victorious. This is something that was not, it did not happen at that time, but it was fulfilled after that was revealed, maybe about 7 years later. And subhanAllah, interestingly, is that Edward Gibbons, anybody knows Edward Gibbons? He's really the authority on the Roman history. He said that Muhammad of Arabia basically prophesied the victory of the Romans when it was the furthest thing from happening. Another aspect of it is the unseens. And the unseen, what we call the ghaib or ghaibiyat, are things that we have not witnessed, that we cannot see. Yani, for example, technically anything that you cannot see directly is an unseen. But what we're talking about in here is things like the self of God, like the angels, the jinns, you know, the hereafter. as you mentioned. So these all are actually under the unseens. Okay? So that's what the religion actually is about. Alhamdulillah. So in this area, you'll have some of these things. You'll have actually some of these things, and there might be an area of overlap. What could be an area of overlap, like I mentioned earlier? Are you with me, by the way? Are we communicating? Are we connecting? I see some blanks in there.
You said the fetus, maybe?
Yeah, certain things. As I said, there are certain areas, just to test you back. We said there are 3 reasons why you could have, why the religion could address aspects related to science. I may want to give them back to me. I just said that, right? Come on. Yes.
One reason is to kind of like, since those things cannot be proven during the prophet's time, it was kind of like, if they are revealed, it's kind of proof.
So their value is to indicate a bigger reality. In other words, they're meant as tools. They're not meant for themselves, but they're meant as tools. Okay? That's one of them, to prove that this is a book not written by a human being, because a human being could not have known these things at that time. What else? That's one. There's 2 more. Don't fight, please, one at a time. What? Just, yeah, it could be just, just general instructions, general advice. This is good for you, this is not good for you, this is bad, this is, when the Prophet ﷺ, for example, says that don't squander the use of water even if you are on the bank of a flowing river. This is something that is related to daily life, basically, in a way, but in a way, it's also related to conservation and whatnot. Even if water is included in the bill, in your rent, it doesn't mean that you can basically just waste water. Here the Prophet is saying that even if you are on the bank of a flowing river, do not waste the usage of water. There's 1/3 reason why the Quran addresses. Is to indicate that life, actually both are part of the continuum. In other words, our life includes all of that. Sometimes we tend to think too academically, that we tend to divide certain things in our mind, and we forget that sometimes we arrange them that way so we can study them more easily. But the reality is, all of that actually is connected together. When you're leading your life, you don't say, now I'm gonna basically behave politically. Now I'm gonna behave economically. Now I'm going to behave, physically. It's just part of the same thing, but the divisions are made in order for us to study that. Now, so if science and religion, they overlap in this particular area. So this is really what we're talking about. Now, if both are accurate, there should not be any discrepancies in that overlap area, right? If both tools are accurate, then they should come to the same conclusion. Science is knowledge attained through experimentation. Religion is knowledge attained through revelation. But both of them are knowledge, and both of them are different tools to deal with different things. I cannot use the scientific tools, to measure everything that is religious. I mean, obviously, the scientific tools have their usage. They're not used to give you all information about everything. So I cannot subject something that is unseen in nature, to some physical tools that are meant to measure something that is really tangible. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. So, but in the area, and this is in the area that they will not overlap. So in the area of overlap, if they are accurate, both of them are accurate, they should come to the same conclusion. Because both of them are means to attain knowledge. So if there's a discrepancy, then if they come to a different conclusion, then one of them actually is wrong. And there's a reason actually why that could be wrong. When you look at science, this is science. Some of the information in science is probabilistic, and some of it is conclusive or certain. Probabilistic means most likely, And this is, by the way, it is with almost all actually scientific research. I can tell you at least biologically, is that that's why you have statistical tools. You come to a conclusion that this is the conclusion with 90% certainty level, which means I'm 90% certain that this is the conclusion. But you still have the 10%, right? So it is not conclusive. It is still actually under probabilistic. So here you have some experimentation, and here you have theories, actually. This would be the biggest probably item in there. And there are theories that have not been verified. In other words, they have constructed a certain model or certain things based on certain observation, and you have a certain model that has not been proven, actually has not been verified. And you have, like I said, experimentation and whatnot. Conclusive is that which is certain under science. And here we have two things, like what? What do we have in there? You have the physical laws. I mean, these have been proven over and over again, or anything that is a law, not a theory. And you have certain facts, certain observable facts. So science, actually, is not all conclusive, and is not all probabilistic. It has something that is probabilistic, certain things that are conclusive. Okay? So we have these two. Now, under religion, you have the same thing. Religion meaning, Islam, of course. You have that which is probabilistic. I'm going to hold the same sort of the same way. And you have that which is conclusive. What would be under probabilistic? Something that is part of the religion, but it is not certain. Think about it. Do you have anything, any information in the religion, in Islam, that is not certain? Can you think of an example? Yes.
Wait, under the lens of Islam or under
Islam.
Okay, under the lens of Islam, some hadith.
Some weak hadith.
Yeah.
So in other words, if you have a narration, meaning a text, a hadith, that is not authentic, right? This will be probabilistic. So let me call it unauthentic, or non-authentic, whatever you want to call it, non-authentic. Authentic narrations. A hadith or something by other than the Prophet ﷺ. What else? There's another, yes?
What about Laylatul Qadr?
This is an example of that. This is an example of that. What actually Laylatul Qadr, we don't know exactly what it is. We don't know exactly what it is. So that information is not there, actually. We know where it's most likely to be. Another example of what's probabilistic would be something that is authentic, but the meaning is not clear. So here we're talking about even Quran, by the way. I mean, not all the Quran has a direct meaning, right? So here we're talking about authentic, whether hadith or Quran, and here you can say almost exclusively the Quran. The Quran, or the what's called mutawatir ahadith. But let's say something that is authentic, conclusively authentic, and the meaning is clear. An example? Something from the Quran with a clear meaning. فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Know that there is no God but Allah. There's only one God. This is conclusive in the meaning and in the authenticity. Or for example, when Allah says, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There's nothing that resembles Him. This is another example, of authentic meaning and conclusive, authentic text and conclusive meaning. Okay? Another example of that. The creation of Adam. This is another example of that. In other words, that Adam actually Adam was created as he was. He did not come as a result of a successive changes. So this is here, Adam, can go under that. The ahadith, you have multiple ahadith that indicate that Adam was created as he was. So this would be in there. Okay? Now, so the question is, just in here, we'll first finish with this model. So far, and we believe that's the way it will always be, that which is conclusive in one has never contradicted that which is conclusive in the other. So you don't find a Quranic verse with a clear meaning that contradicts with a physical law or a scientific fact. We have not seen any of that. If you have any discrepancies or contradiction, it could be that either of them are probabilistic or both of them are probabilistic. In other words, you have something that is conclusive in one but probabilistic in the other. An example of here is Adam, creation of Adam. It is probabilistic in science, it's not really conclusive. Or an example would be that something that is physical or scientifically conclusive, but in the religion it's probabilistic, it's not open in there. Okay? So the question is, then what about the, by the way, you tell me when I have to stop.
You have like 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes? Okay, well, I may stop even before, so I think probably, I want to make sure I'm not seeing much action going in there. This way to get your question and your comment. So when you're talking, for example, about the theory of evolution, everybody wants to know about that. Where does that fit in this whole thing?
Probabilistic.
Probabilistic where?
Science.
What about religion?
Conclusive.
Conclusive?
Probabilistic.
So on this in here, where does evolution fall? What?
Probabilistic science.
Evolution.
Religion.
It's not even an area of overlap. Except with Adam, creation of Adam, by the way. The creation of Adam is there. You know? But what about the other species? You know, it's in there. Islam does not say it happened. Islam does not say it did not happen. Islam does not say anything about it. That's why, if you can prove it scientifically, Islam does not have any problem with it. That's why it's not an issue. It's not an issue actually with Islam. It might be an issue with other religions, but not with Islam. That's why Islam does not say it happened, does not say it does not happen. You know, but evolution, by the way, it will always be in here. Even though sometimes it is taught and preached as if it's conclusive, but it will never be conclusive. For one simple reason is that it's a historical reconstruction. It is not something that has been observed. It is something that is actually reconstructed based on observing historical information. That's why it will always be in here at the most. It will always be here. So again, did it happen or did it not happen? Well, I think if you look at all the different facts and evidence, you will find, I mean, this is my conclusion, that I think there are certain actually variation among closely related species. You could have certain variation, but that does not explain the difference or the development of the large divisions that we see in nature. In other words, the fact that you have a certain species of moths, for example, closely related, one, let's say, evolving into the other, does not explain the fact that a fish can develop into, let's say, an amphibian. This has not been explained, and we still have actually big, large gaps. So that's why I think it is still at the level of theory, and if you look actually even weaker theory, well, if that's the case, how come it is so widely accepted? I do believe that it's a fact that the way it is, that what contributes to the spread of any ideology or any idea does not always actually, is not always connected with the merits of the idea itself, but more related actually to social and then political conditions, political facts, and political factors. And that's the way it is actually with the evolution. You know, if it wasn't Darwin, it would have been somebody else. And there was actually another scientist at the time who was about to publish something closely related or similar to what Darwin has published, but Darwin basically beat him into it. And what happened, Darwin just came at the right time, at the right place, where people were trying to basically loosen the grip of the church. And here's someone that came and gave a basis for that. That's why his followers actually had an agenda that he himself did not have. He himself actually was not as zealous about his own theory as the neo-Darwinists actually are, the followers were. So that's why you'll find that actually according to the different texts, he seems to be actually, he was not an atheist, but he was more of an agnostic. He was someone that had certain questions that troubled him. And first of all, related to his own personal life and his own suffering, and also he said that he was troubled by the suffering in the world. So he had some big questions, but he was not really an atheist himself. Unlike some of his followers that took his theory and then used it for their own, like I said, political agenda for whatever. So the followers become more zealous than the founder. Just like we observe people actually being more Shafi'i than Imam Shafi'i himself, right? Or more Hanafis than Imam Abu Hanifa himself. People that follow the madhab, you know, more strictly and more blindly than Imam Abu Hanifa meant actually for that madhab to be. That's the way it happens. that you think the followers becoming actually more, strict followers of that than the founder. I'm going to stop in here. If anybody has any question, I think you probably do. Otherwise, we're going to go home. We're sitting, we're not going anywhere.
So the conclusion here is that evolution for other species, would you say like non-humans, potentially could have happened, but for humans, it's out of the question.
For a human, it's out of the question, and I think it's what I take that from the conclusive in the religion. For the other species, I think it did not happen either.
Okay.
I think it did not happen because the big gaps still exist. I mean, you look at the different analyses. Again, the big gaps still exist among the distant species, and since the time of Darwin, these gaps have not been filled. It's like as somebody said that like you have trees, and you have basically species at the end of the trees, of the branches, and Darwin was hoping that you will find basically the ones that would lead into that, and the fact we have discovered more branches end than any actually thing in the middle. So it has not. Now you tell me then what happens? I tell you I don't know what happens. If Darwin actually, or the Darwinian model did not happen, then what happened? I don't know what happened. I know what did not happen, but I don't know what happened.
Can we agree that there is some microevolution and macroevolution where every species has a genetic adaptation to evolve in that?
Yes. Well, see, the thing is that microevolution has been observed to a certain degree, but to extrapolate that and extend it into macroevolution, that's what the problem is, and that's where Darwin actually messed up. When he thought that the accumulation of the micro would lead to the macro. Well, here you have different mechanism altogether. It's like somebody that says, for example, the change in temperature during the day, like from the morning to the afternoon, can accumulate and explains the change among seasons. Those are two different mechanisms in there, right? I mean, the change during the day is due to the rotation. The change, among seasons is due to what? The tilt of the axis, right? It's not the same thing. And that's the way it is. That's the way it is. We have observed some closely related, and I think it has to do with the mechanism. Now keep in mind, by the way, Darwin actually developed his theory before a mechanism was even put in place, before the gene was discovered. That came later on with Mendel, right? And then after that, then they started thinking about the, the diversity and then the selection. But even there, people actually argue that basically natural selection reduces diversity, if you think about it. Because if you put a pressure in a certain environment on a diverse species, you're going to end up with one species or one particular genotype, let's say, one particular actually form within that species. Now, then what about the diversity? Well, the diversity, according to the Darwinian model, has to be established as fast as it is disappearing. And of course, here came up with the mutation, which is, of course, is an aberration. So technically, you're losing diversity more or faster than you're establishing diversity. That's why at that level, this is one of the ways of looking that the mechanism doesn't work. The mechanism doesn't work. But let's say if, big if you ever proved that it did happen, we don't have any problem with it. Islam does not have any problem with it. Islam does not say it did not happen. And it did not say it happened. It's in the area that is here. Like many other scientific things. It's in there. It's not in there. Because the reason I'm saying that, because sometimes what happens, we just follow trends and we repeat questions that may not be relevant to us. So let's say people, of other religions, may raise certain questions that is troubling them, and it may be an issue with their religion, but for us it is not. So if it is an issue with them, it doesn't mean it is. Or vice versa, by the way. That's why I said this is about Islam, it's not about other religions. So what I'm saying applies to Islam, not about other religions. Yes?
Oftentimes people try to prove evolution by stating speciation. Can you explain the difference between the two?
I'm not really sure exactly what you're talking about, but I think. Yes.
I think he's saying that there's a difference between evolution and adaptation. when in speciation you have an emergence of a new species.
Yes, yes, yeah. The species and the definition of species is basically, and this is the only objective one, is that we're productively isolated individuals. Those are two different species. But even there, by the way, there are exceptions. You'll find exceptions in the nature, you know, as different species where we're not reproductively isolated. That's why even there, actually, it's not completely actually accurate. What I'm saying is that I think this is pretending to have all the answers, but it does not. It does not, you know. And the fact that you have that, it doesn't mean that everything actually came as a gradual, through a gradual process. Yes, ABR.
When it comes to the scientific miracles in the Quran, is there significance why there are certain scientific miracles focused, like
yeah, I said,
in the tafsir?
yes, I said that these actually have a purpose. These are tools to prove the value of the text. You know, there are certain things. How do you know that the Quran actually is a divine book? There are certain things, now what we call al-i'jaz al-Qur'ani, that what's the miraculous aspects of the Quran, that proves that this is not something that could have been written by a human being, you know, an illiterate also, no less, you know. That's why this is a divine book. An example of that, one of them is really the scientific miracles, as we call them. And these are certain verses that describe certain scientific facts that were not known at that time. However, here I would really caution, you know, sometimes my brothers and sisters, not to overuse that in a way that that is not, how should I say, sometimes what we do, we stretch the meaning of certain verses so much as to fit certain scientific things that we see ourselves. And sometimes the scientific observation that we're linking the verse to may not even be certain. Or what if that then proved to be wrong? What happened to the verse? That's why I think this has to be properly used. That's why, you know, unless it has to be in here, something that is inclusive, scientific, and the meaning has to be clear as well, in light of that. So that, even that rule has to be used properly. Of course, there are other aspects in the Quran, like the legislative aspect, and the big one, of course, is the language itself, the language of the Quran itself. Yes.
When it comes to the language of the Quran and how, you know, people who interpret the Quran, a lot of people who try to disprove the Quran say that there's a problem in the interpretation of the language, how one word actually means another. How do you know?
Interpreting the Quran is not just a random process. There has to be certain indication. You know, of course, the first thing is that you cannot interpret the Quran through translations, which is the people that criticize the Quran, that's what they refer to. They refer to actually translation, and of course they said that's what the Quran says. Well, wait a minute, you're looking at translation. And translations, of course, can bring an element of error. It cannot, it does actually. Because no two words translate exactly into one another. So what happens a lot of the time when you translate, sometimes you add certain meanings to the word, and sometimes you take away from the original meaning of the word. That's why if you want to interpret the Quran, you have to refer to the original language, to the Arabic language. And of course, it is the classical, the Fusha Arabic, but I would say not even all, not any Fusha Arabic. It has to be the Arabic language the way it was used at the time of the Prophet. That's why the scholars of tafsir, of interpretation, they particularly pay special attention to the Jahiliyyah poetry, to refer to the way the word was used at that time. Why is that important? Because with time, words acquire new meaning. This is in any language, by the way. You know, through time, you'll have new meanings that are added to a certain text. You know, the connotation versus the denotation and whatnot. And an example in here that always comes to my mind is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, as-sa'ihuna was-sa'ihat. You know, as-sa'ih, those that understand Arabic, what is sa'ih in the Quran? What does sa'ih mean? Sa'ih. Sa'ihun, suwah, siyaha. Tourist. You know, today the word sa'ih means tourist. So when the Quran says, as-sa'ihuna was-sa'ihat, the male sa'ih and the female sa'ih, does that mean the Quran is encouraging tourism? Of course not. This is a new meaning of the word, sa'ih, translating into tourism. But at that time it meant something different. Now when I'm interpreting the Quran, I have to look at the way it was at that time, not the way it is used today. You know, that's what the scholars of tafsir pay attention to that. And part of that, of course, is to understand the difference between the metaphor and the direct meaning. When do you refer to one? When do you refer to the other one? the conditions surrounding the revelation. That's why interpreting the Quran is a process. It's not a random thing that has to be left to everyone. That's true for any discipline, by the way, any science. You cannot bring somebody who has slaughtered a couple of sheep or a couple of chicken and then ask him to interpret the human body. Well, I've seen. Well, what have you seen?
Last point, because I know
Yeah, but you're
okay, so I'm bringing it back. So I've heard people say that if they're really adamant about the theory of evolution, that's all their entire basis, more or less, of the argument of disproving religion. I've heard scholars say that you can interpret the creation of Adam saying like it happened, quote unquote, if you want to say like another dimension. Like in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to like he took the pledge from the people when they were all souls, right? You can say that the creation of Adam happened in a similar, whether you want to call it an alternate dimension, doesn't need to necessarily be on planet Earth, and therefore, was Yasir Qadi. He's saying it's potentially probable that it happened, but it doesn't necessarily, like, you can't really debase Islam through it.
Well, see, the Quran and the Hadith said that Adam was created actually in another world, another dimension, whatever. And of course, before that, he used to live in Al-Jannah, in a certain Jannah, by the way, different than the Jannah that inshallah, all of us will go there. And then, of course, he was brought to the earth. Now, some people say when he brought to the earth, something changed. Like he was described as being that, what and what. Now, they said, but when he came to the earth, then he acquired his new shape. So there is a certain process of change as described in there, but this is not the change that he went through one species to another gradual thing, because he was described as he was created. The creation process was described. It does not indicate anything related to a gradual actually change from one form to another. We good? Going once?